Good morning. We are continuing our study of the period between the Testaments. We started last week, didn't quite finish up. We were talking about the Synagogue. And, of course, as mentioned, as far as the origin of the synagogue, Jewish tradition holds that it sprang up or developed during the Babylonian captivity, but we don't really have a real record left of the origin of it. It's one of those kind of odd things that it began, and sometimes something becomes so ingrained in culture and tradition that we just say, well, I don't really know where that started from. It obviously it did have a beginning, because you don't read about this in the pages of the Old Testament, but finding exactly what that origin was has been, at least heretofore, impossible for historians and archaeologists. But we talked about what we do know about it was that it very much, as far as how they conducted services and things like that, very much resembled the order of services, or not necessarily the order of services, but the worship of the New Testament church. We read about it in the New Testament. So you see a lot of influence there. One of the things that we mentioned was that when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, of course, there was this prevailing idea in the ancient world. That idea typically was that if you were defeated, your god or gods were inferior to the other nation's god or gods. But of course, the prophets kept emphasizing over and over again, Israel, Judah, has been defeated not because their God is weaker, but because their God is punishing them. And the prophets really, really drive this home, and God, in His providence and in His wisdom, places Daniel right there in Babylon in the king's palace, and he's telling Nebuchadnezzar over and over again, don't get cocky. You didn't win this because you're so great. You didn't win because your God is so powerful and you he overpowered the Israelites' God. You won this because the God is using you for His purposes. Sometimes Nebuchadnezzar listened to that, sometimes he didn't. But you got Daniel there in the palace. You have Jeremiah back in the homeland who's telling the Israelites, you weren't defeated because your God is not capable of saving you. There is but one God. He is Jehovah. You were defeated because you have forsaken Him. And now you're going to have to take your lumps. And it's going to be 70 years. It's not going to be a short captivity. Plant your gardens. Seek the good of the land where you are. Because, this is not going to be just a few days or a few weeks. It's going to be 70 years. And then, of course, among the captives in the captivity, you had Ezekiel, who prophesied and told them, captivity is going to be long. You need to be seeking God, turning back to God. But God is looking after His people. But even, again, with the Gentiles, Nebuchadnezzar and those in the court, He's got Daniel instructing them. Of course, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were there as well. But that's pointing out to them that God is not incapable of saving. Of course, Cyrus let some of the Jews go home. Some people did, some people did not. More did not than did. But they rebuilt the temple. They had sacrifices restored. But what about the people that don't go home? And that's kind of where synagogue worship pops up. They continue to pray. They continue to study the scriptures. And so synagogues developed to support that. And even in Jerusalem, even back home, they used the temple for sacrifices, for feasts and special things like that. But there would be synagogues even back in the homeland, because they would use those for prayer, Bible study, and so on. And we talked about a lot of that. I can't remember if I mentioned it or not last week, but we've said it before. You needed a quorum of 10 families to organize a synagogue. Well, that's not a whole lot. And so as you can imagine, in very nearly every town, you had just 10 families, they'd organize a synagogue. So there's synagogues all over the place. But again, this is God's providence. This is God's wisdom, His foresight, foreknowledge, and getting the stage set for the gospel to spread. And so, again, we've talked about it before. Paul goes into a city, he goes to the synagogue. And that's where he first goes. Doesn't always stay there very long because sometimes he receives a better reception than at other times. But, and this is one of the things that we mentioned, I think we did cover this last week, that the worship there in the synagogue, the service, there was a lot of liberty in those services. There was great freedom in the services. Any competent Israelite could participate. And you see that in, I believe it's in Acts 13, where the fellow in the synagogue just says, does anybody have a word of exhortation? And so Paul says, hey, I do. Say it on. And so he gets up and begins to talk about Jesus. And, of course, that was the beginning of the end of his being in the synagogue, because some of them listened, but some did not. But it offered a ready-made audience. One of the things I don't think we covered last week that I wanted to get to was we sometimes misunderstand this, and in fact, I think I probably gained some clarity on this myself, both from Pfeiffer's book, Between the Testaments, but also through, I ran across I think it was on David Padfield's site. He has like an entire, I don't know, I think it was like 70-something pages study on the Sanhedrin. And I don't know if I realized before, I don't know how I missed it. It's one of those things where I sometimes think, surely I knew that, but I don't recall that I did. But maybe you did, maybe you didn't realize that Sanhedrin is a general term, but it's also a specific term. We typically use it very specifically. And typically when we use it, we're talking about what would technically be known as the Great Sanhedrin. And by the way, you'll hear me sometimes say Sanhedrin, sometimes Sanhedrin. I finally looked this up, and it's based on dictionary pronunciation. They say you can pronounce it either way. So I pronounced it for years, Sanhedrin, and then I heard somebody say it the other way, and I thought, oh, I've been pronouncing that wrong all this time. And so then I started saying Sanhedrin, and then I found out you could do it either way. So sometimes I just waffle between them because I've pronounced it both ways. But there's, in a larger town, you needed, 23 elders would form the Sanhedrin. In a smaller town, you could have 7 elders that would form the Sanhedrin. This served as a court. You would have these elders. They were called rulers, and among them is a chief ruler. Sometimes you read in the New Testament about the chief ruler of the synagogue or something like that. That would be a reference to chief among the Sanhedrin. But it served as a court. And in Judea, it would represent the civil as well as religious government, at least to an extent. Why do we say to an extent? Do what? Well, yeah, when you get to the time of Jesus, Rome. And there's certain things Rome says, no, you're going to need our permission for that. Scholars are kind of divided on this. I read, I can't remember where it was. I read just recently, it was before doing this class, where I read a couple of different commentators. I think I was maybe studying something, I don't know if I was preaching on or going to do a lesson on the crucifixion. I was writing an article for Papaw on the resurrection. And so I was researching for that and just doing some reading. And I ran across a couple of commentators. I wish I could remember who, I'd tell you, but pretty well known and scholarly people that they took the position and even offered some evidence that the Sanhedrin in the Great Sanhedrin there in Jerusalem did not have to have Roman authority to put Jesus to death. And I forget why they said they involved Pilate in it. But anyways, they were saying, a lot of people say, oh, they just had to have Roman permission, but they did not. I still don't think I agree with that, because why involve Pilate at all? The Sanhedrin would have viewed themselves as, we don't want to have anything to do with Pilate unless they had to. And I think that they did have to, because Rome wasn't going to go for them pronouncing the death penalty and carrying out the death penalty. A lot of folks, I don't think this was the extent of their argument, But a lot of folks will say, well, they could, and if they couldn't, then what about Acts chapter 7? I mean, Stephen was murdered, right? And martyred, first Christian martyr, at least the first one we read about. Well, I think the answer to that is just look at the situation. I mean, they're in a frenzy. They stop their ears. They gnash on him with their teeth. They're not stopping to think, oh, wait, hold up, guys. We better get permission first. They're just going crazy, and they kill him. And so, I think that's the answer to that. But anyways, that's just throwing that out there. If you ever run across that, some scholars say they didn't really have to have Roman permission, but it does seem like, and Pfeiffer talks about that, that he takes the position that, yeah, they could not carry out the death penalty. But scourging, what does Paul say? Of the Jews I received 40 stripes save one. And we've talked about that before. This is one of those things at the Biblical History Center, and I talked to the one in charge of the volunteers because I caught it in the notes. When you're at the crucifixion section in the notes that they have for the volunteers, and I've heard several of the tour guides say it throughout the times that I've been there. In fact, some of you, we were down there on I think a Saturday, or it might have been a weekday, and I think I kind of whispered over to some of them, that's not quite right. But they would say something talking about crucifixion, that Jesus was scourged by the Romans, and they would say, and it's in the notes, he would have been scourged 39 times because the Romans considered it cruel and unusual to scourge a man 40 times. But that's not right. And I when I got the actual copy of the notes, I emailed the lady and I said, you might want to check on this because I don't think I did some research on it. And I said, I can't find anything where the Romans believed that. I thought that said now the Jews did. That's in the law. They were told, you don't, if a person needs to be punished with a whipping, a beating, a scourging, you don't go above 40 lashes. Because anything above that will be cruel, and this is your brother. That's kind of the paraphrasing what the law says. And so the Jews got to wear two different positions on this, depending on, you look at scholars. The Jews got to where they would say, we're going to do 39. We don't want to go over and do 40 because they didn't want to do 40 because what if we miscounted? And if we accidentally went to 41, well then, we've just, gone and condemned ourselves. So that's one position. Another position that some people take is that the Jews would use a scourge that was kind of like a whip, but it had, we talk about the Romans had their cat of nine tails. That was typically what they would use to scourge. That the Jews would use something that would have a lot of times 3 leather straps coming off of it. And so for every time you lashed with that was 3. And so they would do that 13 times. Is that right? Okay. I'm always nervous when I start doing math in my head. 13 times, and that's 39 lashes. But if you went 14, you see now you've gone 42. And so that's what some people say is the reason for the 39 or the 40 save one. But either way, it was the Jews that did that. Look, Romans, they didn't care. They didn't consider much of anything cruel and unusual punishment. It was very common. I don't know if I'd say very common, but you read in history that it was not an uncommon thing, at least, for someone to die from the scourging. Never even make it to the cross. They would just die from the scourging. But the synagogue, the Sanhedrin, they could carry out punishment of scourging, excommunication. I think we did touch on that a little bit last week. Excommunication, or I think we have at least in the last few weeks. This is hard for us to overstate. I don't know that we fully appreciate what an excommunication would have meant to a Jew, especially living in the homeland. Look, if you're in Alexandria, there in Egypt, and you're excommunicated from the synagogue, that's still a huge deal. But there are lots of Gentiles surrounding you, and you could always, I guess as you view it in your mind, if you wanted to, just say, I guess I'm just going to go hang out with the Gentiles over here. But if you're living in Judea and Palestinian area, and especially in Jerusalem, and you're excommunicated from the synagogue, where are you going to go? I mean, without just pulling up stakes and completely, I mean, it's life-altering. So they would, in fact, a lot of times excommunication would only be a temporary thing just for that reason. I mean, it was just that serious. But again, death could also be decreed, but that had to be, at least best we can tell, that had to be with permission from the Roman procurator. But each community would have its own Sanhedrin. And this is what I was saying, that I'm not sure I realized this before. Each community would have their own, and it would function on that smaller scale. But then in Jerusalem, which is the one we typically are reading about, I dare say maybe every reference in the New Testament references the great Sanhedrin, which would have 70 members, and the high priest would kind of preside over that. He was the 71st. It was scribes, mostly eminent members of the high priestly families that were associated with the great Sanhedrin. They met in a hall that was associated with the temple structure. You see this, by the way, with the crucifixion of Jesus. The material I mentioned, it's long. It's a long document on the Sanhedrin. When I was working on sermon planning, I don't know, it was like 2 weeks ago, I lost about 2 hours one night because I ran across this document and I was like, I'm just going to check this out. I was going to peruse it, and I did kind of just peruse it, but I would have lost like a day if I'd tried to read the whole thing carefully. But it's fascinating, and in that document, in that paper, if you want to call it that, it's kind of arranged more outline format, but he points out how and where the Sanhedrin violated. So, I mean, every aspect of Jesus' trial was it was illegal from start to finish, and they violated their own rules. And in some cases, they violated Roman rule. They violated scriptural mandates that were laid down by the law of Moses. And so he shows that in that. It's really, really well done, well put together material on the Sanhedrin. And you can tell the fellow did his homework. I think it was Padfield that did that. He has some stuff on his website that's not by him, but I think that one was by him. But anyway, the guy did his research. You can tell, and he's got his sources listed, and there are just a number of those. I'm struggling with the same thing from last week. How much I want to mention about the synagogue. It's just it's so important. Let's go to let's go to Deuteronomy 6. He mentions, he being Charles Pfeiffer in his book, that the synagogue worship early on was very simple. They'd have prayer, reading Scripture, explaining Scripture. But he says by the time of the Mishnah, which would be 2nd or 3rd century after Christ, by the time of the Mishnah and 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, there were 5 principal parts enumerated as far as synagogue service. You have the Shema, prayer, reading of the law, reading of the prophets with a benediction, and then a translation and explanation of the Scripture. And what we're looking at here in a couple of 3 different passages is this, what's referenced as the Shema. It gets its name from a Greek word, and it consists of these 3 passages. Who's got Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9? Okay. So they would have a benediction. Maybe start off with this benediction, and then someone would stand up. And they'd say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, Jehovah our God is one." And carry on through that. And of course, Jesus quotes a part of that when he was asked, what is the great commandment in the law? And he quotes from Deuteronomy 6. Now go over to Deuteronomy 11. Bob, are you still there in Deuteronomy? Just, if you don't mind, I'm going to get you to read. Let's just go 13 through 21. Let's grab the whole thing there.
And it shall come to pass, if you shall hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love Jehovah your God, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, and that I will give the rain of your land in its season, the former rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in the grain and your new wine and your oil. And I will give grass in the field for cattle, and you shall eat and be full. Take heed to yourselves, lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods and worship them. And the anger of Jehovah be kindled against you, and he shut up the heavens, so that there shall be no rain, and the land shall not yield its fruit, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land which Jehovah has given you. To what?
21.
Therefore you shall lay up these words in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them for a sign in your hand, and they shall be for frontlets between your eyes. And you shall teach them to your children, talking of them when thou sittest in thy house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. And you shall write them upon the doorpost of your house and upon your gates, that your days may be multiplied, and the days of your children in the land which Jehovah sware unto your fathers to give them, as the days of the heavens above the earth.
Okay, so they have a benediction. They read or quote from Deuteronomy 6, read or quote from Deuteronomy 11, 13 through 21. Of course, they didn't have the chapter and number divisions as we do today, but they would mention this, and you can see why. It's something they would do over and over again to remind them the Lord your God is one. I mean, again, what was one of the main reasons? Numero uno for captivity? It was idolatry. They're going to remind themselves, remind their children, remind themselves, God is one. Love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then here, look, he's promised he's going to give us first rain, latter rain. He's going to bless us. But if we don't follow him, then there are going to be consequences for that. And then Numbers 15. If you want to turn to Numbers 15, I'll grab that one, 37 through 41. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, is 37, I guess really 38 through 41. So he says, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you seek not after your own heart and your own ways and your own eyes, after which you used to go a whoring, that you may remember and do all my commandments and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. So they would quote these three passages or read them after a prayer, and then there would be another prayer. But it mentions several times frontlets, and he mentions here riband is what the word the King James has. You may have a note in your Bible there. It says cords. He mentions fringes in the borders of your garments. What does Jesus call them in the New Testament? Phylacteries. And in fact, this is one of the things that I learned from Mr. Vern down at the Biblical History Center. In John chapter 4, Jesus comes up. He's tired. He's going through Samaria. He sits down at a well, and this woman comes to draw water. Of course, she comes in, which is not the typical water drawing time for women. They usually came early morning or later in the evening. She's coming in the middle of the day. Why? She doesn't want to deal with anybody. She's probably outcast, or maybe she's been made fun of, or maybe she, whether in reality or just perceived, feels judged and looked down upon, whatever. So she's coming to avoid social contact. Jesus sits down there and he begins to talk to her, and one of the first things that she says to him is what? Of course, he asked her for a drink. And she says, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask drink from me, a Samaritan? Well, if you ever, the Jews and the Samaritans, there was some difference and, of course, animosity, but it's not like you look at them and say, oh, they look so different. They all look like Middle Eastern Palestinian people. It's not like, one is black, one is white, one is, far darker skinned, maybe more of a tan complexion, one is pale. They all look like Middle Eastern, Palestinian people. How did she know, here's a Jewish man? And it was the tassels, the phylacteries, seems to be the best answer for that, because that's something that a Jewish man would have had. They had these phylacteries, these fringes, and of course the Pharisees loved to make broad their phylacteries. They wanted to make a big show of them. It wasn't meant to be a show. It wasn't anything wrong with the phylacteries, the frontlets. There was nothing wrong with that. Scripture talks about it. You can use that as a reminder. You ever put something, maybe in your office, maybe in your bathroom, just on the mirror? I remember sometimes, you read Scripture and you just read over stuff. I remember reading over, of course now I'm going to go blank, Psalm, I want to say 68. But anyways, there's a verse in Psalms that says, "Blessed be the Lord our God, who daily loadeth us with benefits." I just never really stopped to think about that. Every day he loads us with benefits. And that just struck me. And for years when we lived in Ringgold, that was taped to the mirror in my bathroom. And I just wanted to remember that every single day. That, hey, you know what? If you're alive and upright, he is loading you with benefits. Yeah, you may have problems, but God is loading you with benefits every single day. That's what frontlets, phylacteries, that's what this stuff was meant for, as a reminder. But of course, the Pharisees kind of took that and they wanted to make it about a show. But all that just to say that's kind of some of what was going on in the synagogue service. I did mention last week very briefly that, there were great leaders and learned rabbis that would suggest suitable prayers, and they got really hung up about prayer. And, John taught his disciples to pray, and so the disciples come to Jesus at one point and they say, "Lord, teach us to pray like John taught his disciples." Nothing wrong with being taught to pray, but they got really, really detailed in how you had to say a certain way and certain things, and it would even get to be about vain repetition. Jesus is going to rebuke them for that. And so when the disciples asked Jesus to teach them how to pray, he gave, some people call it the Lord's Prayer, really better titled the model prayer. And so he's giving them some very general principles to guide how they approach God in prayer. But all this is part of the service of the synagogue. Even every Israelite, even minors, could partake in the reading of the law within the synagogue. Yes, sir, Tim?
That about Jesus and the woman at the well, is that speculation, or is there something in John chapter 4 that reveals?
No, it just seems to be from how the Jews would dress compared to the Samaritans. That would seem to be most logical way that she would recognize him as a Jewish man. Probably from how he dressed, because sometimes that question will come up with people, and they'll say, "Well, how would she know he's a Jewish man?" And there may have been other things as well, but yeah, there's nothing there in the actual text. That's just kind of using some deductive reasoning, and it may or may not be the entire reason. It may or may not be part of the reason, but it certainly would fit, because that was what the Jewish men typically would do. In fact, they actually, I'm told, again, this would be something that's from studying history, but I'm told that every family had a unique way of making their tassel. It was uniquely woven, unique design, and it served almost like, it was very similar to like a credit card today. And so what you could do is, as a father, if you're busy getting ready, maybe you got guests coming or something, or maybe you're tending to the fields or whatever, you could send your son to the market, and he's going to take your tassel, and he goes to somebody, whether he's buying meat or vegetables or whatever it might be, and he could use that, and it's kind of an IOU. It's like paying on credit, because you had that own unique one for your family, and that verified, okay, I'm authorized to buy for the family. So kind of a neat thing there with the tassels, the phylacteries, frontlets, and all of that. The synagogue building, I won't say too much about this. He does mention, Pfeiffer does in his book, our synagogue knowledge comes from descriptions in literature and also ancient ruins. They've actually excavated synagogue buildings, but most of our information on the synagogues come from comes from the time after Jesus' ministry. So you have to bear that in mind. But there are some things that we could figure out. The best article of furniture there was the ark, it was called. That was by the wall farthest from the entrance. The center of the synagogue would have a high place with a lectern there for teaching and so on. And then the rest of the room would contain these wooden seats. But there were what they called chief seats. They were close to the ark, and they faced the people. And you remember what one of the rebukes of the Pharisees was? They loved the chief seats. And then Jesus, even on one occasion, harking back to the book of Proverbs, it's kind of interesting because obviously no synagogue service in the book of Proverbs, but it's just kind of a common sense principle in Proverbs. In Proverbs, the wise man's not talking about chief seats, but Jesus makes application specifically to those chief seats, and he says what? Sit in the lowest seat. And then, wouldn't it be great? Isn't it much better if you sit in the lower seat and somebody says, "Oh, Bob, no. You come and you have one of the seats of honor, brother." Than for you to go and just take it upon yourself to sit in one of the seats of honor and somebody goes, "What are you doing?" Out. And then, as Jesus says, you begin with shame to take the lower seat. Well, that's reference to those chief seats. They're close to the ark. They faced the people. You're in full view of everybody. And, of course, the Pharisees, they loved that. That's what they always wanted, was to be in full view of everybody. The front of the synagogue was typically made to face toward Jerusalem. It would have three different entrances. They always sought, if they could, to put it on any time they built a synagogue. By the way, the synagogue, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the term synagogue referred to the service, but also to the building. Kind of a lot of times the way we use church. We'll say, and we understand it, and sometimes I'll mention to people, this is the building, this is not the church is the people. Well, same thing with synagogue. They understood that. And some brethren even today, they'll get so picky about this. They will not put out here on the building or anything like that. They will not put or even on the sign, Bremen Church of Christ. They'll put what? The Church of Christ meets here. And I'm not going to criticize somebody that's got a tender conscience. But I think, when you think about that, if somebody starts trying to bind that and say somebody's sinning if they put the name on the sign, because that's not the Church of Christ, the church is the people. Well, my answer to that is, a lot of times on our mailbox, it'll say Chad Dollahite. I don't think anybody drives by and thinks, "Look at that, old Chad's a mailbox." I think everybody understands with some common sense, that's where you're getting your mail. You put Church of Christ on a building, physical edifice, sign, whatever. I don't think anybody thinks that is the church. It's where the church is meeting. But anyway, so that's that idea. But they would typically try to put the synagogue on the highest spot in the city. They like to do that, and they also would typically, if they could, try to get it close to water, because the services and things involving water. But interesting information about the synagogue. There's so much that we could say, and I tried to condense that down, and we talked about it really about 2 weeks, and I guess just a little bit of a third week. But all that is because, and he says this, Charles Pfeiffer does in his book, Between the Testaments, it's hard to overstate the importance, what the synagogue meant to the Israelites sometime shortly after the Babylonian captivity, and especially when they come home, and what it means to the spread of Christianity when the gospel begins to be preached the first day of Pentecost after the resurrection. There's just so much there, and there are references like the chief seats and things like that, the chief ruler and stuff like that just don't make nearly as much sense if you don't have some kind of a knowledge of the synagogue. So I did want to cover that. Any questions or anything on that? I know I almost hate to I debated on talking about the Septuagint today, but I think I'm going to wait on that because I think I want to talk about that more after we talk about Alexander. And I was thinking there was something else I wanted to mention about the Sanhedrin. There was something I want to mention about them. Go over to the book of Acts. Just thinking in terms of the Sanhedrin, and particularly the great Sanhedrin, they had authority. We mentioned in Judea it's civil authority as well as religious authority. To an extent, obviously, if they wanted to carry out the death penalty, all evidence seems to point they had to get permission from the Roman procurator. But if you go to Acts chapter 9, there's a man here named Saul. And Saul is breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. And he goes where? Acts 9, verse 1. He goes to the high priest. Who presides over the Sanhedrin? The high priest. And what is Saul here desiring? Letters to Damascus to the synagogues. You see, if he gets a letter from the high priest and he takes it to the synagogue in Damascus, they don't look at that and go, so? They look at that and go, oh, okay, carry on, because that carried authority. And so he goes to the high priest and says, hey, I want you to give me some letters. I'm going to go to Damascus. I'll present them to the people there, and then I've got backing. It's all a networking thing. And so he wants letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found any of this way, that's a reference to Christianity, the way. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, John 14:6. So if he found any Christians, whether men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem. Well, if somebody should, a lot of times at this point, Jews and Christians sometimes were hard to distinguish. There's not a whole lot of difference and sometimes even some overlap, not always scripturally. Well, here he's got somebody bound. Maybe you got a spouse that's upset, or children or parents that are upset, and what's going on? And they go to their synagogue leader, and this Saul guy's coming and he's dragging off our relatives or our friends. And Saul says, the synagogue leader there might say, what do you think you're doing? I mean, you're a Jew, right? Yeah. What do you think you're doing? And he hands him the letters. And you know what the synagogue leader in Damascus now says? Oh, well, and he turns to those family members or friends and he says, well, I'm sorry. He's been authorized by the great Sanhedrin. So, that's the idea of the authority. And that's why it mentions specifically there, he wants letters so he can go to Damascus, take them to the synagogue there, and if he finds any of this way, brings them bound to Jerusalem. And of course, it's in the midst of that journey that he had, the Lord had other plans for him. He's gonna find out that what he's doing is not the will of God. He's doing this not just to be mean. He thinks he's doing God's will, which of course is what Jesus told the apostles in John 16:2. The time's coming. People are going to think, he that killeth you will think that he does God's service. So that's, again, you see the great Sanhedrin is typically what's referred to in the New Testament, but they had that authority that was both religious and civil. Tax collectors we'll talk about under the Roman Empire. I'll save that for then, and we'll talk about the Septuagint when we get to the Roman Empire. What we'll do next week, I'm not even going to start it because there's just no point. We'd barely even get into it. But next week we'll begin talking about Alexander. I like what Charles Pfeiffer calls him in his book, the Apostle of Hellenism. You recall, I wanted to take a week or two to talk about the synagogue, but it also gives us a break from the historical aspect, because I know we talked about a lot of history, and sometimes it's hard to wrap your mind around all that. We'll get back to that a little bit next week, Lord willing, because you remember the Persian Empire was in decline, and they were having trouble. They wanted to conquer Greece, but they never could quite conquer Greece. And then they started having trouble keeping a hold on keeping order in their Greek colonies that they've conquered. They'd conquered some of them. Well, it's kind of interesting because the first real union of Greeks that came about was, as Pfeiffer points out, was accomplished by a man who really technically wasn't even a Greek. He was Philip, and he was from where? Macedon. Philip the Macedonian, right? And so he brings about kind of an alliance, but he really couldn't bring his plans to fruition because he was murdered, and his young son took over, and at a very young age began to lead a campaign. And he would really conquer the whole known world and be dead by the age of 33. And that man's name, of course, was Alexander. We call him Alexander the Great. He was not strictly a Grecian himself. He would be a Macedonian, being the son of Philip, but he was thoroughly Hellenistic. He was thoroughly Greek in culture. He believed that was the best cultural way. And so that's why he's often called the apostle of Hellenism. By the way, when you hear the term Hellenism, it's just a reference to Greek culture. You'll hear that term a lot in intertestamental studies, sometimes even in New Testament studies. Hellenists, Hellenistic, Hellenism, it's a reference to Greek culture, Greek way of life. And it's interesting, by the way, Aristotle educated Alexander. And it's said that he carried on when he would go around on campaigns, he carried a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey with him. But a very, very interesting fellow, and kind of almost a contradiction in many ways. It's just tragic what happened. But about 11 years that you're going to deal with Alexander really, really in life impacting history. But that 11 years or so far outlived the man as far as his influence on the world, and especially the Jews, and getting ready for the advent of the Messiah. All right, so as I said, we won't get into that today. I knew we were just too close on time, but we'll talk about Alexander next week. Again, his time is pretty short, and then we'll get into some of his successors and see how this begins to affect in a very, very strong way the Jewish people, and how it affects the incarnation of Jesus as he's getting ready to come into the world. Thank you. We'll have a break, as always, before our worship period.